August 12, 30 BC, Alexandria. A woman sits in a palace chamber dressed in gold and purple. Two servants stand beside her. One holds a basket of figs. In 10 minutes, all three will be dead. But this isn't a story about how Cleopatra died. It's about the 10 days before, when the man who would become Rome's first emperor used isolation, false promises, and one unspoken threat to dismantle her piece by piece. No torture, no violence, no execution. Just a Roman who understood that breaking a queen was more valuable than killing her. The weapon that finally destroyed her wasn't an army or a blade. It was her son. And the most disturbing part isn't what happened in that chamber. It's how methodically Octavian made sure she had no other choice. August 1st, 30 BC. 10 days earlier, Alexandria's harbor was burning. 12 months before Cleopatra and Mark Antony had assembled the largest naval force the Mediterranean had ever seen. Over 500 warships, legions from a dozen kingdoms, everything staked on one battle. They lost at Actae off the coast of Greece. Their fleet shattered not in hours, in minutes. Ships rammed and burning, commanders abandoning formation, Antony's flagship pursuing Cleopatra's retreat while his navy died behind him. The alliance collapsed immediately. Kings who had sworn loyalty withdrew their troops overnight. Roman senators who had supported Antony sent letters to Octavian pledging allegiance. Gold meant for soldiers disappeared into private vaults. By the time Antony and Cleopatra returned to Egypt, their army existed only on paper. Now, a year later, Octavian's legion stood outside Alexandria. Inside the city, the betrayals accelerated. Antony's cavalry defected first, riding out to Octavian's camp in full formation, switching sides without a single casualty, then his infantry, then his remaining ships, which sailed out of the harbor and surrendered their weapons before a battle even began. The palace, which once held audiences with kings and philosophers, became a place of locked doors and whispered panic. Officials fled, servants vanished, guards abandoned their posts. Antony moved through empty corridors, shouting orders to soldiers who were no longer there. Cleopatra made a different calculation. She retreated into her mausoleum, a massive stone structure she had built years earlier. Designed as both tomb and fortress, the building had one entrance, 3 feet thick walls, no windows. Inside, she gathered her most valuable possessions: gold, jewels, incense, ebony, centuries of accumulated treasure from the Ptolemaic dynasty. Then she sealed the doors from inside. Her plan, if it was a plan, remains unclear. Ancient sources suggest she intended to burn everything, denying Octavian both wealth and trophy. Others claim she hoped to negotiate from a position of strength, using the treasure as leverage. What she did next changed everything. She sent a messenger to Antony with a single piece of information: she was dead. Whether this was strategy, desperation, or something else, the effect was immediate. Antony, already unraveling, accepted the news without question. He ordered his slave Oes to kill him. Oes refused and killed himself instead. Antony took his own sword, drove it into his stomach, fell, but he didn't die. The wound was fatal, but slow. He lay bleeding on the floor of his chamber when the truth arrived. Cleopatra was alive inside her mausoleum. What happened next is documented by Plutarch in detail that feels almost surgical. Antony's body was carried to the mausoleum. The entrance was sealed. Cleopatra refused to open it, not from cruelty, but from calculation. Opening the door meant losing her only fortification. Instead, ropes were lowered from an upper window. Antony's dying body was hauled up the exterior wall. Cleopatra and her 2 attendants pulled him through the window themselves, dragging a Roman general up stone walls while he bled. He died in her arms inside the tomb. By the time his body stopped moving, Cleopatra was completely alone. No army, no allies, no kingdom, and Octavian was already inside the city planning what to do with her. What Octavian does next is one of history's most calculated mind games ever recorded. Subscribe now, because the psychological warfare you're about to witness makes every thriller you've ever seen look amateurish. This is where it gets disturbing. Octavian didn't want Cleopatra dead. Dead queens don't parade. For over a decade, Octavian had fought a civil war against other Romans, against Antony, against the Senate, against anyone who challenged his consolidation of power. Publicly, he needed to transform that internal conflict into something else. A living Cleopatra walking through Rome in chains would do exactly that. She would become proof that Rome had defeated a foreign threat, not butchered its own citizens. The civil war would be rewritten as a defensive victory against an Egyptian queen who had seduced and corrupted Roman men. The propaganda was already prepared, but Octavian also understood the risks. Cleop must not die. This wasn't mercy. It wasn't even cruelty. It was logistics. Octavian needed Cleopatra alive and intact for his triumph in Rome, the public procession where conquered enemies were displayed before execution. He needed her recognizable, walking, unable to claim she had been tortured or broken. But he also needed her compliant, and that required a different approach than force. Octavian visited Cleopatra 3 days after her capture. No record exists of their exact words. What remains is the structure of what happened next. He entered her chambers without guards, a calculated gesture, sat across from her, spoke in measured tones about possibilities and futures. He made no explicit threats. He made no concrete promises. Ancient sources describe the conversation as almost courteous. Cassius records that Octavian listened to her speak about Julius Caesar, about her children, about Egypt's value as a stable province rather than a chaotic territory. He responded with vague assurances, mentioned that cooperation might influence how her children were treated, suggested that arrangements could be made, never committed to anything specific. That ambiguity was the mechanism. Cleopatra, trained in negotiation, tried to find leverage. She presented detailed inventories of Egypt's royal treasury, offered to cooperate in transitioning power smoothly, emphasized her children's ability to maintain stability. Octavian took notes, thanked her for the information, then left. Over the following days, the pattern repeated: brief visits, polite conversations, questions about treasure locations, palace operations, loyalty among Egyptian officials. Cleopatra provided answers, believing each piece of cooperation bought negotiating space. What she didn't realize was that Octavian wasn't negotiating, he was cataloging. Every detail she provided about Egypt's wealth went directly to his officials for seizure. Every name she mentioned of loyal supporters was investigated and neutralized. Every piece of information became a tool for dismantling what remained of her kingdom. Meanwhile, her isolation deepened. No visitors were allowed except at Octavian's discretion. No messages came from outside the palace. No news reached her about what was happening in Alexandria, in Egypt, in the wider world. She existed in a bubble of managed information where the only voice she heard was Octavian's, and he told her only what served his purpose. Then Cleopatra made her own move. She stopped eating. The servants noticed first. Meals returned untouched. She grew visibly thinner, weaker. Within days, she developed a fever. It wasn't a hunger strike in the modern sense. There were no demands attached. It was simpler. If she died from illness, from refusal, it would deny Octavian his triumph just as surely as poison. The guards reported it immediately. Octavian's response was swift and specific. He didn't force-feed her, didn't threaten her, didn't raise his voice. According to Cassius Dio, he simply clarified the situation. Her children were in his custody. If she harmed herself, they would suffer consequences. The text doesn't specify what those consequences would be. It didn't need to. Cleopatra resumed eating that same day. Now the trap was complete. Death meant her children died. Compliance meant humiliation, erasure, and eventual execution in Rome. Silence meant waiting in uncertainty. While Octavian consolidated everything she had built, she had no moves left except one, but she didn't know it yet because she didn't know about her son. Cleopatra had 4 children, 3 with Mark Antony, twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and a younger son, Tommy Philadelphia. They were 10, 10, and 6 years old, royal blood but politically manageable. Octavian could control their futures, raise them as Romans, marry them strategically, neutralize their claims. They weren't the problem. The problem was Caesarion, 17 years old, son of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra, not adopted, biological. His full name was Tommy the 10th 15th, Philippa Felita Caesar. The last part was what mattered. When Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, his will named his great-nephew Octavian as his adopted son and heir. That adoption gave Octavian his name, his political legitimacy, his entire claim to power. But adoption required will and documentation. Biology required nothing. As long as Caesarion lived, Octavian's position was vulnerable, not immediately. Caesarion was young, foreign, had no army. But futures are built over decades. Rome could tolerate many rivals. It could not tolerate a living son of Caesar who might someday challenge an adopted one. Cleopatra had understood this since Actium. After the naval defeat, before returning to Alexandria, she had made arrangements. Caesarion was sent east toward the Red Sea with tutors and guards. The plan was India. Far enough from Rome to be irrelevant, rich enough to build a new life. His survival became her only goal. Everything else, the treasure negotiations, the conversations with Octavian, the cooperation, was theater. Buying time, keep different. He was Caesar's blood. As long as he breathed, he was a threat. And Octavian had spent years eliminating threats with surgical precision. The psychological war was over. Cleopatra had lost. Now she focused on the only victory still available. August 12, 30 BC. Cleopatra woke in her palace chambers, bathed, dressed in full royal regalia, gold, purple, the formal clothing of Egyptian pharaohs. She requested permission to visit Antony's tomb. The guards, following Octavian's orders to allow reasonable requests, agreed. She went alone, except for 2 attendants. At the tomb she performed the proper rituals, poured libations, spoke to Antony's memory, not romantically according to Plutarch's account, but practically, telling him she would join him soon, that their enemies had won everything except their final surrender. She returned to the palace, ordered a meal, specific items, figs, bread, wine. While she ate, she wrote a letter. The letter was sealed and given to a servant with instructions to deliver it to Octavian immediately. Then Cleopatra sent away all servants except her 2 closest attendants, Iris and Charmian, women who had served her for decades. The 3 of them remained in the sealed chamber. What happened next is constructed from aftermath, not observation. Sometime in the afternoon, Octavian's guards became suspicious. The chamber had been silent too long. The servant who delivered the letter had looked distressed. Octavian opened the letter. It contained one request: that Cleopatra be buried beside Mark Antony. He understood immediately. Guards were sent running to her chambers. They pounded on the doors, demanded entry. When they finally broke through, they found 3 bodies. Cleopatra lay on a golden couch, dressed in full royal regalia, dead. Iris lay on the floor beside her, also dead. Charmian was barely alive, using her last moments of consciousness to straighten Cleopatra's crown, adjusting it so it sat properly. One of the Roman guards, furious, demanded, "Was this well done?" Charmian answered. And these words are recorded by multiple ancient sources suggesting they were witnessed and remembered. It was well done, and fitting for a princess descended of so many kings. Then she died. The actual method of death remains uncertain. Ancient sources suggest poison, possibly an asp hidden in the basket of figs, possibly a vial concealed in a hairpin or jewelry, possibly something else entirely. Modern scholars note that asp venom works slowly and causes visible convulsions. 3 women dying simultaneously and peacefully suggests a different poison, possibly extracted from plants, possibly from compounds Cleopatra would have had access to in the palace. The mechanism matters less than the outcome. Cleopatra was 39 years old. She had ruled Egypt for 21 years. She had survived Julius Caesar's assassination, a civil war, multiple political purges, and the collapse of her kingdom. She died on her own terms in royal clothing, surrounded by loyal servants. Octavian had conquered everything she built, but she denied him the one thing he needed most, her alive and broken in his triumph. Octavian was, according to Cassius Dio, genuinely furious, not because Cleopatra was dead enemies stopped causing problems, but because she had chosen when and how. He had spent 10 days carefully constructing her surrender, managed our isolation, controlled her information, used her children as leverage, created a scenario where her only logical choice was cooperation. She had found the one gap he couldn't seal. Still, Octavian was practical. He honored her request. Cleopatra was buried beside Mark Antony with full ceremonial rites. Her body was prepared according to Egyptian tradition. The tomb was sealed properly. This wasn't sentimentality. It was optics demonstrating that he respected traditions, that he was merciful to defeated enemies, that Rome was a civilizing force. Then he finished what he had started. Caesarion's fate is recorded in a single line by Plutarch. Caesarion was sent by his mother with much treasure through Ethiopia to India, but Roden, his tutor, persuaded him to go back for that Caesar designed to make him king. Caesar, however, put him to death. No trial, no public execution, no ceremony, just efficient removal of a political problem. Cleopatra's other 3 children were sent to Rome, raised by Octavian's sister. The twins eventually married into Roman families. Tommy Philadelphia disappears from historical record, likely died young from illness. Egypt became a Roman province, not a senatorial province governed by Roman nobility, but Octavian's personal territory, the grain supply, the wealth, all directed to consolidating his power. Within 3 years, Octavian became Augustus, Rome's first emperor. He won everything. The civil wars ended, the republic transformed into empire. His rivals were eliminated, his power became absolute. Everything except one thing: Cleopatra's final surrender. Cleopatra's death wasn't romance, it wasn't weakness, it was the last available move in a game, where every other option had been systematically removed. When Octavian stripped away her kingdom, her allies, her freedom, and her son, he left her with one remaining form of control: how her story would end. She chose a golden couch and royal regalia over chains and humiliation in Rome. Octavian conquered Egypt, but he never broke her. And the most disturbing part of her final 10 days isn't what she did in that chamber, it's how methodically he made sure she had no other choice.